The showdown in court. The day had started like any other. Kimberly Wright, an FBI agent, had woken up early, slipped into her crisp black suit, and grabbed the stack of files that would form the foundation of her case. She was used to the daily grind, the endless paperwork, and the quiet anticipation that always surrounded her when a case reached its tipping point. Today was supposed to be the day that everything changed. Today, she would present critical evidence in a case that had been building for months. The kind of case that could change the lives of many, the kind of case that brought her pride as much as the burden of responsibility. She arrived at the courthouse with a calm resolve, though she could sense the weight of what was to come. The case she had been investigating involved some of the city's most powerful figures, men and women who were untouchable, or so they thought. But Kimberly had spent the last few months tracking their every move, gathering evidence, and making connections that no one else had been able to see. Today was the day she would expose them for the frauds they were. She was ready. The courtroom was already packed with journalists, lawyers, and even the occasional onlooker who had caught wind of the high-profile nature of the case. Kimberly didn't pay much attention to the crowd. She had learned long ago that it was the facts that mattered, not the applause. She walked straight to the front, her shoes clicking against the marble floor with a steady rhythm. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, and yet, it didn't matter. She had a job to do. As she reached the front of the courtroom, she gave a respectful nod to the judge, who had not yet taken his seat. Kimberly was a seasoned professional, and she knew how to command attention without saying a word. But as she stood there, preparing to present her evidence, something unexpected happened. Officer Thomas King, a bulky man in his late 40s, approached her. Kimberly had seen King around the courthouse before. He was a frequent presence in the building, usually standing guard in the background, doing his job with little fanfare. But today, there was something different about him. As he got closer, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her uneasy. She tried to brush it off, chalking it up to her nerves. But what came next was completely unexpected. "You're not FBI," he said, his voice thick with disdain. Kimberly froze, her hand halfway to the stack of evidence she had prepared for the judge. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and sharp. She turned to face him, surprised by his audacity. The nerve of this man to question her, to challenge her right to stand in this courtroom. For a brief moment, she thought she had misheard. But there was no mistaking the sneer on Officer King's face. He was staring at her as if she were some kind of imposter, a fraud, someone who had no place in this prestigious courtroom. Without responding, Kimberly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her FBI badge. She extended it toward him, a clear and irrefutable symbol of her authority. She had done everything by the book, and she expected him to recognize that. But instead of taking the badge, King swatted her hand away like it was a nuisance. His eyes filled with contempt as he sneered, "That badge is fake. You better come quietly before you make it worse for yourself." Kimberly could feel the blood rush to her face, the heat of anger and frustration mixing with the chill of disbelief. Was this really happening? Was she really being challenged, in front of everyone, by a man who had no idea who she was or what she had accomplished? The courtroom, once filled with the quiet hum of hushed conversations, fell completely silent. It was as though time had frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the judge, who had been about to preside over the case, remained silent, his eyes flicking from Kimberly to Officer King, unsure of how to react. Kimberly could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, but it wasn't the way she had imagined. She wasn't being admired for her courage or professionalism, she was being treated like a criminal. King stepped closer, towering over her now. His words were laced with venom as he continued to berate her. "You don't belong here," he said. "You're not FBI. You're just some woman playing dress-up." Her heart pounded in her chest, the humiliation and anger bubbling to the surface. But she held her ground. She had trained for this. She had fought through more adversity in her career than most could imagine, and she wasn't about to let this man's racism and ignorance take her down. Kimberly extended her hand again, this time with more force. "I am Agent Kimberly Wright, FBI," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You're making a mistake. Release me, now." But instead of acknowledging her words, King grabbed her wrist with a roughness that sent a jolt of pain through her body. He twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her down onto her knees. The cool, smooth surface of the wooden rail pressed against her cheek as he held her in place. The room seemed to close in around her as she struggled to breathe, not just from the physical pain but from the emotional toll it was taking. Her mind raced. She had never imagined a moment like this, being forced to the ground, in front of a crowd, by a man who thought he had the right to dictate who she was based on the color of her skin. She had earned her position. She had worked for every ounce of respect she had, and now, in this moment, it seemed like it meant nothing. The whispers around her grew louder. She could hear a couple of deputies chuckling nearby, but no one in the crowd dared to speak up. They had all fallen silent, caught in the tension of the moment. Some of them pulled out their phones, unsure if they should record this scene or turn away. But no one, not a single person, stepped forward to intervene. It was as though they were all complicit in the act. Kimberly's mind flashed back to every injustice she had faced in her life, every time someone had doubted her because of her race or her gender. But this time, it wasn't just a personal attack, it was a public one. A betrayal by the very system she had sworn to protect. But as the officer continued to taunt her, she remembered why she had joined the FBI in the first place. She wasn't just here to solve cases or put away criminals. She was here to fight for justice, to stand up for the truth, even when no one else would. And that's when Kimberly made a choice. She would not let this moment define her. No matter how humiliating, no matter how painful, she would not back down. She would stand up, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been judged before their time, for every individual whose worth was measured by their appearance, not their actions. The moment had not yet passed. There was more to this story than anyone could imagine. And Kimberly Wright, though forced to kneel in front of her tormentor, knew she would rise. She would rise, and when the time came, she would make sure Officer King, and everyone else, understood that justice would prevail. The struggle for justice. The sound of her wrist cracking under the pressure of Officer King's grip reverberated through Kimberly's mind. The coldness of the wooden rail against her cheek, the sharp sting of humiliation in front of a room full of strangers, it was overwhelming. Yet, beneath it all, Kimberly could feel something deep within her, a fierce determination that wouldn't let her collapse under this injustice. She was more than just an agent, she was a symbol of resilience, a force against the bias that sought to bury her. She tried to steady her breath, her lungs tight as she held her posture, unwilling to show weakness. She could feel her muscles tense, but she refused to let the pain break her spirit. The courtroom was still silent, and all she could hear was the sound of Officer King's breath coming in heavy, impatient huffs. He was enjoying this moment, but Kimberly had lived through worse. She had faced down corrupt officials, crossed lines that others had dared not cross. But this? This was personal. This was a man who had decided, without knowing a single thing about her, that she didn't belong here. "You think you're FBI? Think you're some kind of hero?" Officer King spat, his words filled with scorn. "You don't get to pretend to be something you're not." His voice was laced with the same prejudice that had followed her throughout her career. "It's pathetic, really. All of it." Kimberly's gaze didn't falter. She stared straight ahead, trying to block out the pain. She refused to let him see her crack. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who saw her as nothing more than a statistic, a threat to their own warped sense of order. But today, in this courtroom, she was going to show him that her presence wasn't a mistake. She wasn't just an agent, she was the truth that would unmask the lies he believed in. As she knelt there, still held in place by the officer's unforgiving grip, she thought about the case she was supposed to present. The evidence she had meticulously gathered over the past months. The files she had carried in with her. All of it had led to this moment, this confrontation, this public battle for recognition. But in the midst of the chaos, Kimberly reminded herself of one simple truth: she had a job to do. The voices of the other deputies in the room were starting to fade into the background. Kimberly's mind was racing, trying to maintain clarity in a situation that was anything but clear. Her whole body was on fire, but her thoughts remained sharp, focused. She wasn't going to let this stop her. "You should just give up," Officer King sneered, his hands tightening around her wrist as though he were trying to break her. He thought this was the end for her, a black woman in a suit, trying to play the part of an FBI agent. In his eyes, there was no way she could be who she said she was. And so, he would break her down, piece by piece. "Maybe next time, stay in your lane." But Kimberly wasn't about to be broken. She had come too far, fought too hard to get to this moment. She had earned her place here, in this courtroom, just as much as anyone else. Her breath was slow and measured, her fingers twitching at the cuffs, as she considered her next move. The courtroom, still silent, felt like a pressure cooker, the tension rising with every passing second. It was suffocating, but Kimberly didn't let it overwhelm her. She had been trained to handle worse situations. She had been in life-threatening situations, faced criminals with more malice in their hearts than Officer King could ever muster. But this was different. This wasn't just about physical danger, this was about her identity being questioned, about the essence of who she was being erased in front of her. As she sat there, kneeling before him, she couldn't help but wonder, how many other people, women of color, had been humiliated like this, dismissed and disregarded by those who held power over them. How many had been forced into silence, told that they didn't belong, simply because of who they were? How many had fought in the shadows, their voices never heard? The questions weighed heavily on her mind, but she didn't have time for them now. There was no room for self-pity in a moment like this. The judge had yet to speak. He sat in his chair, eyes flicking between Kimberly and the officer. His expression was unreadable. Did he see what was happening? Did he understand the magnitude of the injustice unfolding before him? The silence stretched on, and the sense of helplessness in the room was palpable. The other figures in the courtroom, lawyers, spectators, and deputies, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Some appeared uncomfortable, some confused, but none stepped forward. Kimberly's mind wandered briefly to her past. She thought about the years she had spent trying to prove herself. She had always been the only woman, often the only person of color in a sea of men who thought themselves superior. From the day she had joined the FBI, she had been treated as though she had to prove her worth, more than the others, more than the men she worked with, more than anyone else. And each time, she had risen to the challenge. She had never let them see her break, even when she felt like the world was telling her to. But now, here, in front of everyone, Officer King was telling her that she didn't belong. She was an agent of the law, trained and licensed, but in his eyes, she was nothing but an imposter. She clenched her fists in silence, fighting the urge to retaliate physically. The urge was there, buried deep inside her, but she knew better. This wasn't the time for violence. This was the time for justice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Kimberly spoke, her voice calm but filled with authority. "I am an FBI agent," she said, each word ringing out with certainty. "You are making a mistake, and I won't let you get away with it." But Officer King didn't relent. He gripped her harder, pressing her against the wooden railing with more force. His power was intoxicating to him. But his grip on her would soon falter. She could feel it in the way his hands trembled, in the slight hesitation in his movements. He didn't expect her to fight back with words. He didn't expect her to keep her composure in the face of his cruelty. He didn't expect her to be strong. As the minutes dragged on, Kimberly's colleagues began to filter into the courtroom, led by Agent Marcus Allen, who had been working alongside her for months on the case. The first sign of hope came when Marcus' eyes met hers. Without a word, he signaled to the others, and the atmosphere began to shift. The first few agents arrived quietly, standing behind the line of deputies. One by one, they approached the scene, their presence commanding attention. As they moved in, Kimberly could feel the tension in the room start to shift. Officer King's grip on her wrist loosened, and his face flushed with realization. He was no longer in control. "Let her go," Marcus ordered, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of the situation. He moved closer, his eyes locked on Officer King's. "You've made a grave mistake, and we're not going to let you get away with it." For a moment, there was silence. Officer King hesitated, his mind racing, unsure of what to do next. But Marcus and the other agents were firm. Their presence was a silent reminder that this was not over. Kimberly wasn't alone. Finally, with a defiant grunt, Officer King released her, stepping back. His face was filled with frustration and anger, but it was clear that the moment had passed. The balance of power had shifted. And Kimberly, standing tall once again, was ready to finish what she had started. The courtroom was still silent, but the air felt different now. The weight of the injustice was slowly being lifted, and Kimberly could see a glimmer of hope in the eyes of those who had witnessed it all. They knew that this wasn't just about her. This was about the fight for truth, for dignity, for equality. And Kimberly, undeterred, was going to make sure that Officer King and everyone else knew it. The unlikely ally. As Officer King reluctantly stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, Kimberly straightened herself. She could feel the burn of humiliation in her cheeks, but it was quickly replaced by the sharp sting of indignation. Her wrist still ached where he had gripped it, but that pain seemed minor now. What hurt most was not the physical discomfort, it was the violation of her dignity, her integrity, and her very identity as a law enforcement officer. The room was still, but there was an undercurrent of movement now. Her colleagues had gathered around her, though none of them had directly intervened during the altercation. Their arrival, however, was enough to shift the dynamic in the room. Agent Marcus Allen was the first to approach her. "Kimberly, you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice low but filled with genuine concern. She nodded, though the words seemed to escape her. She didn't want to admit how shaken she was by what had just occurred. Her mind was still reeling from the shock of the officer's aggression, the disbelief that such an incident could happen in a place where justice was supposed to prevail. Marcus placed a steady hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance. "We've got this," he said quietly, his eyes briefly flicking to Officer King, who was still standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. The other deputies, who had witnessed the scene unfold, now looked more uncomfortable than ever. Some shuffled their feet nervously, while others avoided eye contact, as though trying to distance themselves from the chaos that had just transpired. Kimberly didn't want to let her guard down, but she could feel the weight of the moment starting to lift. She had people on her side now, people who knew her worth, who knew what she was capable of. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since this ordeal had started, Kimberly felt a sense of support she hadn't realized she needed. Marcus turned to face the judge, who had been eerily silent throughout the confrontation. The judge, an older man with graying hair and a weary face, finally spoke, his voice breaking the tension that had hung in the room like a dark cloud. "I believe we should take a short recess," the judge said, his words slow and deliberate. "We will reconvene in 10 minutes. Officer King, please stay here." Kimberly could feel her chest tighten again as the judge's words registered. He wasn't ordering any kind of formal action against the officer, not yet, at least. But at least he had acknowledged the incident. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. He could see the storm brewing in her eyes, the fury she was trying to suppress. "I'm going to make sure this gets handled, Kimberly," Marcus promised. "This won't go unnoticed. They'll pay for this." Kimberly nodded, but she wasn't entirely convinced. She had seen too many situations where injustice was swept under the rug, where those in power used their positions to silence the voices of those who were oppressed. She had been part of investigations that revealed deep-rooted corruption, only to watch as the culprits walked away unscathed. She wasn't naive enough to believe that this time would be any different. As the recess was called, Kimberly made her way to a quiet corner of the courtroom, her mind racing. She had worked too hard to let this incident ruin her career, to let one officer's bias cloud her pursuit of justice. She had spent years building a reputation, fighting for the truth, uncovering hidden secrets, and putting away criminals. But here she was, humiliated in front of the very system she had devoted her life to serving. Marcus followed her, sensing that she needed some space but also knowing she needed support. He leaned against the wall beside her, watching her closely. "Hey, talk to me," he urged gently. Kimberly sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know what to say," she replied quietly. This is beyond frustrating. I've been through worse situations, but this feels different. I don't even know how to process it. I was just doing my job, and now I'm being treated like some kind of criminal." Marcus was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I know it feels like you're fighting an uphill battle," he said softly. "But you're not alone in this. We're going to get through this together." Kimberly's gaze flicked up to him, and she saw the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in hours, she felt a small flicker of hope. Marcus had always been her ally, her partner in the field, her confidant during the toughest investigations. They had built a trust over the years, a bond that had only strengthened with every case they had worked on together. He wasn't just a colleague, he was a friend who would stand by her side, no matter what. But even with Marcus's support, Kimberly knew that this was just the beginning. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. Officer King's actions would not go unpunished, she would make sure of that. But the fight was far from over, and there were still many more battles to come. As much as she wanted to let the anger wash over her, she knew she had to remain focused on the bigger picture, the case she had come to present, the justice that was long overdue, and the people whose lives depended on the outcome. The courtroom doors opened, and a few of the agents Kimberly had worked with began to trickle in. They all exchanged quiet nods, a silent recognition of the injustice that had just unfolded. But there was something else in the air now, something more powerful than the weight of Officer King's bias: solidarity. The support of her colleagues, her friends, was palpable. They had witnessed what had happened, and they were ready to take action. The 10-minute recess passed quickly, and the courtroom reconvened. The judge returned to the bench, and the eyes of everyone in the room were on him. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, and then spoke. "Agent Wright," he began, his voice solemn, "I apologize for the events that occurred earlier. I understand that this is a serious matter. We will proceed with the case, and I assure you that this will not go unnoticed. Officer King, I am requesting a full review of your actions, effective immediately." Kimberly didn't let herself react, at least, not outwardly. She didn't expect much from the judge, but hearing him acknowledge the situation was a small victory. She turned her attention back to the case at hand, pushing the confrontation with Officer King to the back of her mind, for now. But as the case progressed, it became clear that things were going to be different. The agents who had gathered around her, the quiet murmurs of support from the crowd, the small but significant shift in the atmosphere, it was all adding up. This time, Kimberly wasn't going to let her voice be drowned out. She had survived the first test. Now, she was going to win the war. The final reckoning. The courtroom was alive with tension as the proceedings continued, but Kimberly was no longer the only one on trial. Officer King had become the focal point, his actions scrutinized under the harsh light of the law. There was a palpable sense that this case was no longer just about the evidence she had come to present, it had become about something much larger. The systemic biases that had allowed Officer King's actions to flourish unchecked were now being laid bare for everyone to see. And for the first time in a long time, Kimberly felt a flicker of justice stirring in the air. As the case progressed, Kimberly's colleagues, including Marcus, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that Officer King's actions wouldn't go unnoticed. They called for a formal investigation into his conduct, reaching out to internal affairs, and making sure that every aspect of his behavior was thoroughly reviewed. The more they dug into his history, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Officer King had a history of racially charged behavior, a track record of harassment and intimidation, and it was time for that to be brought into the light. But the real turning point came when a surprising ally stepped forward. The deputy who had been standing by, watching the entire scene unfold, approached Marcus during a break in the proceedings. He was a tall, wiry man, in his early 30s, with a youthful face that betrayed the weight of the situation. His eyes were nervous, darting around as if he feared being seen. But there was a certain resolve in his expression, a determination that couldn't be ignored. "I need to talk to you," the deputy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback by the sudden approach. "What's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The deputy hesitated, glancing at Kimberly before continuing. I saw everything. What King did, how he treated her. It wasn't right. And I don't think I can just stand by anymore." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. The deputy was scared of the repercussions, scared of losing his job. It was clear that Officer King had a hold over some of the people in the courthouse, but this young deputy had seen enough. He couldn't stay silent any longer. "I've been with King for years," the deputy continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I've seen things, but this was different. I can't let him get away with it. Not this time." Marcus studied the deputy for a moment, weighing his words carefully. This was a risk, there was no telling what kind of fallout would come from this. But there was something in the deputy's eyes, a sincerity that Marcus couldn't ignore. This wasn't a man trying to save himself, this was someone who wanted to make it right. "You're doing the right thing," Marcus said firmly. "I'll make sure your statement is taken seriously. This can't just be swept under the rug. We need the truth, and we'll get it, no matter what it takes." The deputy nodded, his eyes filled with relief. "I just want to make sure she gets the justice she deserves," he said, his voice barely audible. "I've been waiting too long to see things like this finally change." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the background. But his words stayed with Marcus. In that brief exchange, something profound had happened, something that would change the course of the case, and the course of Kimberly's fight for justice. Back in the courtroom, the judge finally called for a break in the proceedings. The day had stretched on for hours, and Kimberly was beginning to feel the weight of the entire ordeal. But she remained steadfast, her determination unwavering. As the room emptied for a brief recess, she found herself standing alone at the back of the courtroom, her hands resting on the edge of the rail as she collected her thoughts. A soft voice interrupted her reverie. "Kimberly?" She turned to find Marcus standing behind her, a solemn look on his face. "We've got something," he said quietly. Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Marcus didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that told her this wasn't just another routine update. "The deputy," he began. "He's coming forward. He's willing to testify against King." Kimberly's mind raced as she processed the news. This was unexpected, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But there was still a long road ahead. If the deputy came forward, he would be risking everything. His career, his reputation, his safety. There would be those who would try to silence him, just as they had tried to silence her. The stakes were higher than ever. "Are you sure about this?" Kimberly asked, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding her chest. Marcus nodded. "He's ready. But it's not going to be easy. There's a lot on the line for him. A lot of people are going to try to intimidate him, but we'll make sure his voice is heard." Kimberly let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. The weight of the past few hours had been unbearable, but now, finally, there was a glimmer of hope. The truth was coming to light, one piece at a time. But she knew that this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The break was short, and soon the courtroom was full again. Kimberly sat back in her chair, her posture straight and her gaze fixed on the front of the room. She knew what she had to do. She was ready. As the judge took his seat, Marcus leaned in, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "Let's finish this," he said. And so they did. The next few hours were a whirlwind. The deputy's testimony was powerful, his words clear and unwavering as he spoke about Officer King's actions, his long history of bias, and the way he had treated Kimberly that day. There was no hiding the truth. The deputy's account, coupled with the overwhelming evidence of King's misconduct, forced the courtroom to confront the ugliness that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. As the final arguments were made, the judge's decision was swift. "Officer King," he said, his voice grave, "your actions were reprehensible and cannot be tolerated within the law enforcement community. You are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation, and a formal review of your conduct will be conducted." Kimberly's heart pounded in her chest. The justice she had been fighting for was finally within her reach. But it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for everyone who had ever faced injustice, for everyone who had been silenced by the weight of their circumstances. This was a small, but powerful, step toward change. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus turned to her with a rare smile. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. Kimberly nodded, her chest swelling with emotion. "No, Marcus," she replied, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We didn't just do it. We made a difference." The battle was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But today, Kimberly knew that justice had been served. And with the support of her colleagues, she would continue to fight, for herself, for the deputy, for everyone who had been left behind in the fight for equality. And this was just the beginning. The legacy of justice. The weight of the final verdict hung in the air long after the courtroom had emptied. Kimberly stood in the midst of it all, surrounded by her colleagues, her heart racing with a mix of emotions. The courtroom, once tense and full of uncertainty, now felt like a place of triumph, albeit a hard-earned one. Officer King had been suspended, and the systemic biases that had allowed him to act with impunity were beginning to be held accountable. But the fight, Kimberly knew, was not over. This victory was only a chapter in a much longer story, a story that she had been writing for years, and one she intended to finish. She stepped out of the courtroom, her mind still swirling with everything that had happened. The trial had been grueling, not just because of the challenges presented by the case, but because of the emotional toll it had taken on her. For the first time, she had found herself forced to confront the kind of bias that many of her colleagues had only ever read about. But the events that had transpired had left her with something more than just a sense of achievement. They had ignited something deeper within her, a fire she hadn't known she needed, a resolve to continue pushing for justice, no matter what. As she walked down the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Marcus. "Meet me at the office. We've got a lot more work to do." Kimberly smiled to herself, shaking her head. Marcus was always thinking ahead, always pushing for the next step. But right now, she couldn't help but pause and reflect on what had been accomplished. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about systemic change, about showing that no one was above the law, regardless of their position or prejudice. When Kimberly arrived at the office, Marcus was already there, poring over the next steps in their investigation. He looked up when she entered, his face breaking into a grin. "You did it," he said, pushing the papers aside to give her his full attention. "You stood your ground, and because of you, things are changing." Kimberly sat down across from him, her gaze steady. "It's not just me, Marcus. This case, this victory is bigger than all of us. We've got to keep pushing. We've got to make sure it's not just about one officer. It's about every person who's been mistreated, every person who's been silenced. Marcus nodded. And we will. But we can't forget what we've done here. What you've done. You've set the precedent. You've shown the world that justice doesn't stop because of someone's race, their position, or their power. Kimberly leaned back in her chair, taking in Marcus's words. She hadn't thought about it that way before. For so long, she had been fighting to prove herself in a system that didn't always have her back, that questioned her worth simply because of who she was. But now, she realized, this wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about creating a path for others, those who had been pushed aside, those whose voices had been drowned out. The phone on her desk rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, her mind still processing the magnitude of everything that had happened. On the other end of the line was an unfamiliar voice. "Agent Wright?" the voice asked. "This is Officer Harris from Internal Affairs. I've been asked to review Officer King's case, and I want you to know that your testimony, as well as the deputies, has had a significant impact. We're not just looking at King's actions, we're looking at how things got this far, and what we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again." Kimberly felt a surge of hope. It wasn't just about the immediate fallout from King's actions, this was about changing the way things were done in law enforcement, about addressing the root causes of bias that ran through the system. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "This is the beginning, not the end. I'm glad to hear that things are being taken seriously." As the call ended, Marcus looked at her with an understanding expression. "Looks like we've got more work ahead." Kimberly nodded, but for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace in her heart. The fight wasn't over, but the road ahead was clearer now. She had taken the first step in a much larger journey. And though the challenges ahead would be daunting, she was no longer alone in this fight. The allies she had gathered, the people who had stood with her, were now part of something much bigger than any single case or individual. Days turned into weeks, and the story of Kimberly's battle against Officer King began to spread. Her name was mentioned in news reports, her courage and resilience praised by many who had watched the events unfold. But what struck Kimberly most was not the recognition she was receiving, it was the messages she received from people, especially from other women of color in law enforcement, who thanked her for standing up, for showing them that they didn't have to remain silent. One evening, after a long day at work, Kimberly sat at her desk, reflecting on everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed again, and she saw a text message from the deputy who had come forward, the one who had risked his career to tell the truth. "I'm not going to let this go," he wrote. "I've put in my statement, and I'm standing by it. We need to make sure things change. I'm with you, Kimberly. All the way." Her heart swelled with gratitude. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about creating a ripple effect that would spread through the entire system. The kind of change that would take time, effort, and sacrifice. But it was change nonetheless, and it was something she had never imagined she would be a part of. As she leaned back in her chair, a sense of determination settled over her. The fight for justice, for equality, was never easy. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain, she was in it for the long haul. This victory, though hard won, had only ignited a spark. She had started something bigger than herself, and she would continue to fight, one case at a time, one voice at a time, until the system truly reflected the values of fairness and equality that it was supposed to uphold. Kimberly had become not just an agent of the law, but an agent of change. And in the days and years to come, her legacy would be one of unwavering commitment to justice, a legacy that would inspire others to step forward, to speak out, and to never back down in the face of injustice. The story of Kimberly Wright was no longer just about a single case, it had become a testament to the power of truth, to the courage of one woman who refused to be silenced. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the belief that justice, no matter how long it took, would always prevail.